Okay, so welcome to the. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, sure. And you can hear me clearly, right? Okay, yeah. So welcome to the series. I'll do a quick lecture so that we can have a shorter recording for those students to download it and see them at a later date. But at the same time, whatever questions that you have or whatever doubts that you have, you can ask me at the end of the lecture. So today we are going to look at the concluding parts of our site planning and landscape design, series that we've been talking about. So we looked at topography, we looked at hydrology, we looked at soils and geology. Today we'll start with plants and fauna, which is animals or wild animals or whichever in the site. And then we'll also be looking at all the anthropogenic factors. So I will not be going into the details of the anthropogenic factors because those are factors which you already know about, factors that you already respond to in your other AD projects. So once we start the lecture, you'll understand what I mean. Okay, so the world of plants it's amazing, and for us to understand that, it's important that we kind of snap out from our comfort zone of drawing circles in a plan and then calling them trees, or kind of looking at them as objects, which are just there to populate a space. So unlike architecture, wherein the final product would be made as similar as is possible to a 3D that you draw in your studio. In landscape, there is always this challenge or this uncertainty as to how would the landscape really look once it's in full bloom or once it's in its final condition. So because trees have a way of growing, plants have a way of growing. Now I can draw a 3D of that proposed landscape, considering the toolkit that I have and the ability of imagining that space to be in the way that it is supposed to be. But then because of availability of sunlight, because of soil conditions, because of many reasons, the trees may not grow the same way that we want them to grow. The plants may not grow the same way that we want them. So it's important for us to have a very, very sensitive understanding of the site in order to kind of propose a landscape, which is the desired landscape. Now, the image that you see on the screen is that of a creeper, that kind of creeps on the floor. How many of you have seen this? I'm sure some of you may have seen this somewhere, the one with the lilac flowers. I haven't seen them in Mumbai, in the Mumbai coast, but I've seen quite a lot of them in Goa and in the eastern coast of India. So this is a creeper called Ipomea prescapte. It's a very flimsy, feeble creeper that kind of runs on the coast. So where you have the beach, it usually grows near the beach because it can withstand a lot of salt spray, and where there is the sand, the beach, and then the beach kind of moves into form a few sand dunes, and then the rest of the other kind of soils kind of take over. So usually on the sand dunes, like what you see there is a closer picture of a sand dune, near a beach. So beaches also have sand dunes, by the way. So in Mumbai, you don't see them because our beaches are heavily trampled upon. Like we humans keep walking in, walking out. Then we have buildings on the sides. Extra sand is sometimes mined illegally and taken away and mixed with river sand and sold, unscrupulously. So there are all these issues which actually raid an urban beach. So which is why we don't really see a beach in its pristine condition in and around Bombay. But those of you who are familiar with other beaches may kind of follow what I'm saying. So this is a photograph of a sand dune in the far east, in the eastern coast of India. So in 2004, 2004. So in December 2004, there was a huge tsunami that hit the eastern coast of India and many other countries in South Asia. So uh, I was a student there at that time, and I was doing my master's in landscape architecture. And as a part of Government of India, we were sent. Our college was sent as a part of a team, wherein we were supposed to go to a place in Tamil Nadu and do a study of the landscapes, which have been affected by tsunami, and also to kind of prepare a document which the government of India could then look at and then kind of propose a landscape-based strategy, an environment-based strategy for mitigating the effects of tsunami in future. So our idea was to kind of send students from national institutes. So there were other colleges as well. There was IIT also doing some of the study, and so all of us were like clubbed together, and we were taken there for a dedicated study. And you will not believe the kind of things that we really saw. This plant is so flimsy that if like a child can actually pull it up and all its roots will come off, like you can literally kind of pull off this whole thing that you see on the screen in like less than a minute. It's that flimsy, because it's sand and it's got fibrous roots, and it's like just keep pulling it up, it'll keep coming off. But there at site, what we saw was that there are entirely wiped off because of the tsunami wave. While just a few meters, north of that particular area, are you guys still there with me?
Yeah.
Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, sure. So while a few meters just north
No,
of
we
that,
can't see the screen.
We
you
can't see
can't
the
see.
screen.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I also felt that something went off. Yeah, so just a few meters north of that area, we suddenly. Let me just get the screen thing running. Share. There were sand dunes which were intact. And the reason why those sand dunes were intact? Those sand dunes were intact just because it had a good covering of this particular ground cover. Something which is as flimsy as a plant that can be pulled off in like, in a minute. But it could withstand the wave of a tsunami, and it kind of held that whole sand dune together. And this was not one-off incident. While we moved along the coast to different areas for documenting it and kind of mapping down and kind of understanding the patterns, we figured out that this was common in almost all those areas which were affected by tsunami. That was one of the revelations. Something that's as flimsy as this, can kind of protect the landscape. Now, these two images that you see here, that's very interesting because, like, what you see here is an area of, I mean, any coast. I mean, I'm not sure what the source of this particular image is. Even though I've written the source here, but I'm not sure which area it is. So the image that you see here is the image before tsunami, wherein there are some houses which are there with no vegetation cover in the front, while there are some other buildings which are kind of nestled amongst, the vegetation. And that's the beach edge that you have. And after tsunami, if you look at it, those houses which have had a vegetation cover are kind of intact, while those ones which were probably built with the same material, same kind of roof, same kind of strength that kind of goes into building a building near the coast, but which did not have a vegetation cover in the front, were completely destroyed. So there's a small town in Tamil Nadu called Chidambaram. Chidambaram is also near the eastern coast. So somehow magically, Chidambaram was not very much affected by the tsunami. And most people there, kind of said, oh, this is the town of Lord Shiva. There's a very famous old medieval temple in Chidambaram. They said it's because of, God's grace that Chidambaram was kind of saved and all of that. But when we did a little bit more, of research, we realized that Chidambaram was not at the coast. So between Chidambaram and the coast, there was this huge mangrove patch, which is called the Pichavaram mangroves. You can actually Google it up and check it later. The Pichavaram mangroves, which is a sanctuary. It's a MS Swaminathan biodiversity project as well. So they kind of work on that, and it's a mangrove sanctuary. So you will not believe it when I tell you that that mangrove patch kind of absorbed all the impact of that tsunami wave. So even though in Chidambaram the waters did kind of come in because the elevation of that land was low enough, so the waters did move in and it flooded for like some time, and then the waters kind of receded back. But the impact of that tsunami, because if you know how tsunami waves work, it just crashes in onto the land, right? but that entire mangrove patch kind of absorbed all that impact of the tsunami wave. And we took a boat ride through those mangroves, and surprisingly, like you see the rest of the landscape, you find that there are branches which are broken, houses which are devastated, roads which are like kind of cracked like wafers. You have all those things there. Lamp posts which have fallen down and other things. But when we took a boat ride through the Pichawara Mangrove Sanctuary, we found everything to be in order. Nothing seemed as if those mangroves branches were broken, or or there was devastation, or there were uprooted mangroves. Nothing. So the whole mangrove um, swamp kind of behaved like a sponge, and it was so flexible and tensile that it took the hit, and then it just adjusted itself. It absorbed all that force, and then the water only was pushed in. So it's amazing what vegetation can do, and it's the same kind of mangroves that we are clearing every day in Navi Mumbai and near Panvel, to build a new airport, to do all sorts of developmental activities across Palm Beach Road and Seawoods, wherein more housings are coming up. So it's that same mangrove stretch, which we are kind of blatantly, or to make our Seavery, the Navashava, the Trans Harbor Road. So we are kind of, being so ruthless about it without even realizing the power of what, the site vegetation could kind of help us. And unless you know it, unless you see these things, you would never believe, or you would never even preempt that, that a few trees or a flimsy plants can actually, kind of help, create a much more resilient landscape. So it's very important for us to kind of understand this. So that's one side of plants, that the power that plants give. The other side of plants is that not all plants can be really helpful, and not all trees that kind of grow very well and, flower and, kind of be green are always beneficial. This particular tree that you see on the screen, if any of you recognize, can any of you recognize this tree, or do you know this tree, or have you seen this tree?
Um,
Um, yeah,
it absorbs all the groundwater.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So, did I speak about this tree to you in your first year?
My dad told me about it.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. So, can you guess the name of the tree, or do you know the name of the tree?
No, I think it's Nilgiri. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. I'm glad you said Nilgiri, because this isn't Nilgiri, but a lot of students and professionals kind of get confused between the tree which is called Nilgiri, which is known as eucalyptus, from where you get the eucalyptus oil, that highly scented oil. So that's Nilgiri. The leaves of this particular tree look very similar to that of the Nilgiris, but it's not Nilgiri. Okay. So even though Nilgiri is also an exotic species, I mean, it's not a native of India. So Nilgiris are from, even though they're called Nilgiris, and we have a Nilgiri hills, but the Nilgiri tree is actually a native of Australia, the eucalyptus. This particular tree is also a native of Australia, and this is called Acacia auriculiformis. Okay, so it's basically a cousin of our babool or care. Like if you know babool or care. So this is a cousin of babool and care. So it's a leguminous tree, of course. Yes, it fixes nitrogen. Its roots have root nodules which have nitrogen fixing bacteria that live in it. So it may seem to be an innocuous, helpful tree. And I'll tell you about why is this tree so famous in and around India. So the deal is we did have a social forestry program that we started somewhere in the 1970s or 80s. And so it was important for us to kind of, at least the forest department, to kind of, plant trees which grow faster and grow bigger without too much of, maintenance. This particular tree is actually a small shrub that grows in the Australian, dry lands. It's actually a small shrub. It's not a tree as grand or as huge as what you see here. So what this tree does is, when you plant this particular tree in an area like where we have in India, where water is plenty, or where we have rains, and there's a lot of moisture in the soil. You plant this tree. What it does is it just grows into a huge tree in no time, and it stores water within its body. And if you know how leaves work, there is something called evapotranspiration. Like leaves actually, I'm sure you would have learned this. Leaves have stomatal openings. Stomata in the underside of their leaf blades, and wherein gaseous exchange happens. It also gives out water vapor, and that is how rains happen. And all of that you must have learned. But the stomata or the stomatal openings, these small pores at the downside of a leaf from where gaseous exchange happens, they also have two kidney-shaped cells on both sides, which are known as guard cells. Okay, so when enough of gaseous exchange or water vapor exchange is actually done, then these guard cells, they're exactly like two cashew nuts, like two kidneys, like they kind of get turgid and they close. But in this particular, that's how the tree kind of controls the water vapor that it gives out into the atmosphere. But what this particular tree does is, what you see here as these leaves, like the leaves that kind of look similar to that of a nilgiri, these are not leaves at all. Okay, so these are modified petioles. Now, what are petioles? This particular tree does have leaves, but it only has ephemeral leaves. Ephemeral leaves mane ephemerality, right? Something that's short-lived. So poem जो लोग लिखते हैं, they would know what ephemerality means. The tree has leaves which are like imli के पत्ते, छोटे छोटे से, या जैसे गुलमोहर के पत्ते होते हैं ना, छोटे छोटे से पत्ते. The tree does have those leaves, but they only have these leaves when it's a baby tree, when it's a sapling. The moment the tree kind of grows bigger, the tree stops producing leaves. But what they do is they produce a modified leaf. Uh, like every leaf has a leaf blade, which is like that part of the leaf, and it has a leaf stalk. Right, a stalk is a small dundee that connects the leaf to the branch. And that is what is called as a petiole. Okay, that particular leaf stalk. What you see here is basically a flattened out leaf stalk, which looks like a leaf. It's called a phyllodes in botanical terms, phyllodes. So this is actually a phyllodes. It's not a leaf, like biologically speaking, but for all purposes, you look at it, you may call it a leaf. Now, what makes this phyllodes different from a leaf is the fact that it's got stomatal openings. Yes, it does. But its stomatal openings do not have the guard cell. So, in effect, what happens? This tree keeps transpiring 24/7 into 365 days a year, which basically means if you have um, an area which has a lot of water, you plant these trees within 2 years, it'll grow into, or not even 2 years, maybe within like 1.5 years, you'll get a fully grown tree. You get this whole jungle of trees out there. But the water table of that area will keep going down, keep going down, keep going down, and eventually that whole land could become a desert. And why does this happen? It's not because this tree is a villain. This happens because this ability is basically an adaptation that this shrub or tree, I don't even know whether to call it tree or a shrub anymore, has in its original habitat, where it is in Australia, because there, the microclimate of that region needs to be supported. So, these adaptations have been put in by, this large mechanism of our biosphere for some reason. But when we humans, we move around plants from one landscape to the other, from one bioclimatic region to another bioclimatic region, we just kind of play around with, the whole biosphere. So it's extremely important for us to know what to plant where, or if there are some plants which are already there at site, we need to understand whether it's beneficial for that landscape or it's not. And that's one of the aspects. The second aspect is the flowers that you see here. They look beautiful, but these flowers, the stamen of these flowers trigger severe asthmatic reaction in people. So like I know for sure, I've had friends, who had severe asthmatic problem the moment Acacia auriculiformis would start blooming. Um, so, and it's just an automatic reaction. They don't even have to go near the Acacia auriculiformis. And even if there's an Acacia auriculiformis jungle somewhere, far away, like even 2-3 kilometers away, but by that season, they would all get affected by this. So many trees are not beneficial for humans. So understand that and kind of respond to that. Now, the reason why is this tree so popular in India? Like we know that there are problems. It depletes the groundwater. It creates severe asthmatic reactions in people. You cut it. What happens is these trees have an ability which is known as coppicing. Coppicing. Coppicing is basically an ability which most deciduous forest trees have. Like a tree, you cut it at the bottom. What will happen is it will sprout a new shoot from where that bottom stub is. From there it'll put out a new shoot. Nothing will grow below an acacia forest, acacia auriculiformis forest. So what you see in this particular photograph, these are just really resilient, weeds which are kind of growing. But otherwise, if you see an acacia auriculiformis forest, all you see are the dried leaves that fall down. Eucalyptus also has the same, technique of ensuring that nothing else grows near it. Now it's called alleliopathy, wherein alleliopathy is wherein these trees kind of leach out when the leaves fall down. Those leaves, when they disintegrate, they leach out a certain sense of a certain a series of volatile organic compounds into the soil, and that kind of prevents any other sapling from growing. It's basically an adaptation again to ensure that its progeny grows. But then in a landscape as diverse as ours, if you kind of go ahead and plant this in like a large area in the name of social forestry, imagine the damage that we're doing to the environment. And why, now, despite knowing all this, why do we still do it? It's plain idiocy or human greed. So social forestry programs are basically meant so that you quickly plant someplace. It has to get green quicker with lesser amount of resources. So many of the schemes which kind of promoted acacia auriculiformis, or many of the people who are still promoting it even now, don't know the problems that it creates. For them, it's all beautiful. Acha ped ban gaya yaar. I mean, within a year, the landscape project started looking like a proper forest or whatever. So it's basically ignorance, which is one of the key things. The second thing is social forestry. If you know how it works, it's also about it's also about extraction. There are also economies that kind of run along with it. That when the trees mature, a part of it could be cut, logged, and then that could be used, and then you plant again. So that's how these social forestry programs work. This particular tree is one of the best yields one of the best timber for matchmaking industry. So when I say matchmaking, I don't mean matchmaking as in shadi wala matchmaking, but for teeli wala matchmaking. So the softwood that is used for making all those matchsticks, that basically comes from a large part of it comes from acacia auriculiformis as well as other softwood trees. So this particular tree is heavy in demand, in the whole industrial belt of Tamil Nadu and South Indian states, wherein they make a lot of matchsticks. So there are economics, there is stupidity that kind of pushes these things around. So as architectural students, I want you to kind of understand these nuances. And these are just some examples. I can't keep talking to you for 1 hour about trees, but what we would want you to do is to kind of look into other examples as well. Keep your eyes open, try and understand as much as you can, imbibe as much as you can. Now, having said that, trees are extremely beneficial. Like I don't even have to tell you this, but these are just basic norms of like a tree cools as much as like 10 air conditioners which run continuously. The difference between air conditioners and trees is that what do air conditioners do? They basically transfer the heat from an internal environment to the outside. They transfer it, they push the heat outside. So which basically means that the area outside, like let's say for example, a gully in Bandra Kurla complex, like where you have all these tall buildings and where all those air conditioning load, like all that heat is being pumped outside, could actually be hotter than what it was if those buildings weren't running. So air conditioners only transfer the heat outside. But what do trees do? When trees transpire, when the water vapor kind of goes out, or when evaporation happens in general, like where there is a water body, there is the heat energy gets transformed to a different form of energy. So, so what happens is the heat kind of goes down genuinely. I mean, it's not like a temporary transfer of heat from one area to the other, but basically what that happens is there's a transformation of energies from one form to the other. That's the biggest difference between air conditioners and trees, and we humans still haven't figured out a technology that kind of does that. So so be wary of using air conditioners in buildings, or be wary of using a lot of glass on the western facade or on the southern facade. Depending on which area are you building, or if you say I'm planting trees on the west side to cut off the solar radiation, well and good. But if your building is going to be 60-story high, and if it's got like glass panes on all the western facade, and if you're just planting trees on the ground, it's not going to help you. So be very careful about these choices that you make. So when we talk of plants, there are a few key things that you need to kind of think about. We've spoken about them in the past lectures as well. Try and understand if there are any threatened or endangered species, in that particular habitat that you have. Now, how do you know this? It's physically impossible for any of us to kind of learn all those plant names and understand how plants work, in a landscape. So it's better to take help. If you have an ecologist, or appoint somebody in your team, or if you have a friend who's willing to help you out with kind of identifying plants, or who knows about the local plants, it's always good. Try and see if there are invasive plants or if there are noxious weeds. So we know what are invasive plants. We did a lecture, we did speak about them in the earlier lecture. So try and understand if there are invasive plants, or if there are plants which trigger severe reactions. There may be some plants which actually trigger itching in people. If you touch it, then it causes itching. There may be plants which are which have thorns and spikes, which are not really conducive for humans to kind of move around. If there are situations like that, you need to kind of take action, and then try and zoom out and understand where your site is. Is your site in the way of a biological corridor? If there's an ecological corridor, if there are elephants that keep moving in your site, like once a year, or maybe once in 5 years, or whichever. Try and understand these things. Or are there butterfly movements? Are there rodent movements through your site? If there is, then try and design your project in a sensitive manner which allows for that to happen. Now, why do we hear so many instances of animal human conflict? In, let it be in Sundarbans, or be here in our Sanjay Gandhi National Park and all these areas. The thing is, essentially we are encroaching more and more into their their habitats. I mean, even before we humans came in, their habitats were intact. Like elephant corridors, for example, they have a way of conveying, their way of conveying this information, this directional information, from generation to generation to generation to generation. So those elephant corridors, like let's say like between Bandipur in Karnataka, and Wayanad in Kerala, or Idiki in Kerala, and Periyar in Tamil Nadu, and so all these, even though for us we are different states, like we have our political boundaries drawn, but for the forests and for these animals, these are not different states. These were their lands from millennia. They have been walking across these tracts for probably hundreds of years, or maybe nearly 1,000 years. Like generation to generation to generation. So when suddenly the land use changes, or when the political boundaries change, and we humans go and start putting a fence there, that is when all the problems start coming, and that's when we have the animal human conflicts. So we have to be very careful about where our site is. Now, even if our site is within a city, and you would say, oh, isme kya biodiversity, don't be fooled, because that particular patch also may contain a lot of biodiversity. It's important for us to understand what we can keep and what we can't. And if we can't, then is there any other way in which we can compensate for this? So that's also a great way of being sensitive. Are there native plant communities which are being affected by your project? Like, for example, we are making this new airport in near Panvel, right? So a lot of mangrove patches are being completely wiped off. It's essentially being reclaimed for doing this. And the national environmental authorities have kind of given a nod, a go ahead, because EIA, environmental impact assessments, norms are being changed. So there are a lot of things which are happening which are actually not desirable. So, but then development is also important. So then how do you kind of balance these two is very, very important. Are there any distinctive individual plants or communities in your site is also a great learning. So it may be quite possible that, a landscape could be completely obliterated when a city kind of develops. But there may be some patches within that landscape where a particular species of tree, which was prevalent earlier but is now nowhere to be seen there, are still there. So try and see, is your site one of them? If it is, then can you convince your client to not build your building right there? Maybe just preserve that patch and build around it, or maybe find an alternative site. Is it even possible? So try and at least explore those possibilities. Now, vegetation, existing vegetation. Now, designing a landscape does not mean that you clear everything, right? Like you do a clean slate and then you put your building and then you start then imagining, oh, I have my trees and I have my, pathways and I'll do this, this enclosed space and I'll do a secret garden and I'll do this and I'll do that. So that is something that you're creating. But then the existing vegetation may also help us quite a lot. It may shade buildings. It may, have these. You already get a palette of, fully grown trees which are already there for your design to kind of adapt and adopt. So always look at your site with that sensitivity. Don't just start, flattening sites. Don't start looking at a building as it's been designed on a flat site. Always draw out your trees, always understand which are the patches of vegetation, and then start building a building. Having said that, if there are shrubs or herbs, they can easily be, kind of replanted to a different area. While transplanting trees may not be such an easy exercise, and not all trees take transplanting very well. So you have to be aware of it. And then a very, very important thing which we kind of overlook many a times, are there wildfire risks in the plot that you're working with? So, and especially so in Maharashtra, like not maybe for Bombay per se, but for other areas in Maharashtra, wherein you'd find a very stark difference between when it's monsoons, the landscapes are green, right? But when it's summers, let's say Aurangabad or any of these other, the internal areas near Nagpur and all those areas, you'd find that during the summers, the whole topography or the whole landscape, the whole vegetation on the topography kind of turns golden brown and, and orange and, yellow. And so, there is a stark transformation that happens. And during summers, wildfires are a pertinent risk. And wildfires are a natural phenomenon in many cases. And they are actually needed for regeneration of an ecosystem. But the problem is such wildfires, when it happens, there are ways in which it gets controlled. Sometimes it does not get controlled. I mean, that's the way nature works. But the problem is when we humans start, these large scale fires, that is when, things go awry, because, when we do it with a purpose of destroying forests, of changing land use. There are many multiple narratives that kind of go behind it. So, and that's a very dangerous thing, So you have to be aware of, the wildfire risks, and there are ways in which you can control wildfires. Like so, if your site is in an area which is, let's say, susceptible to wildfires, then what you do is you create these patches, wherein you clear vegetation next to your development for like around 10 meters or 15 meters, depending on the height of the vegetation on the other side. You just clear it and you ensure that nothing grows in that patch. So that is basically a dampening patch. So even if the fire kind of comes along, that 15 meters or 30 meters or 10 meters, whichever, depending on the height of the vegetation on the other side, kind of ensures that the fire doesn't spread into the rest of the land. So these dampening patches are very important while you manually have to control a nature scape. Then always ensure if resources can be salvaged or not within a plot. So always be, kind of aware of this. Now, before you start a project, ideally, like in your real life and even in your studio exercises, before you start a project, you should ideally be doing this. You should have a tree inventory, wherein you understand the common name, and the scientific name, of course, but scientific name is sometimes difficult for, for architects to kind of decipher. So have the common name, map all those trees, have a number mapped to that location, and have a table, which says, oh, this is this particular tree. That tree has the trunk of that tree, it's called DBH, diameter at breast height, wherein we need to understand what is the diameter of that trunk at a chest height. So usually, even though it's called DBH, usually what we do is we take a 1.5 meter, 150 centimeters or 1500 height from the ground, and we get the surveyor to measure the circumference and we work out the diameter. This is important for us to understand that, how big that tree is, how big the girth of that tree is. We need to document its health. Is it a healthy tree, or is that tree on the verge of dying? Because if it is on the verge of dying, then you may as well remove it and maybe use that area for something else. What is the height of the tree? Because otherwise, when you get a plan, all you have are these circles which don't make any sense. So if you have to design well for a site, you need to go to site, you need to go with this particular drawing. So get the surveyor to do all of this. go to site with this particular drawing, understand the trees, have a clear enough understanding, photographically document them so that when you design, you can respond to them. How much is a crown spread? What is a crown? Is it the mukut? No, it's not. The crown is basically, that the portion of that tree which has all the branches and the leaves. That's what's called the crown. So your tree spread could basically mean the girth of your stem, or it could also mean the spread of your crown, like where the edge of the leaves are. That's what's known as a crown. So what is a crown spread? So even though we draw all trees as circles, maybe some trees, I mean, none of the trees actually grow in circles, right? I mean, there are different ways in which trees respond. So it's important for us to understand that crown. Otherwise, what happens is, you'll say your whole design may be centered around this beautiful mango tree, and you will sell it to the client, this idea that, oh, I'm creating a courtyard of mangoes. And this, at the end of it, when your building actually gets constructed, you realize that that beautiful mango tree ke sare branches have to be chopped because your architectural expression or your building has been so close to the tree that all those branches have been chopped. So when finally the client, comes in and on the day of the inauguration and he look at the mango courtyard and he'll look up and he'll see only one stub that kind of goes up because the branches have all had to be chopped because the architect thought maybe the tree had an equal spread, but the truth was that the mango tree kind of grew to one side. So too late, to kind of control the damage. So it's important to understand the crown spread as well. And also, once you get it, so this is about site analysis, but once you start, developing your design and, once you start, giving out your drawings for landscape, it's also important to kind of give a very detailed set of maintenance recommendations because unlike architecture, in landscape architecture, what happens is much of it depends on maintenance. A beautifully done landscape could also go down the drain if it's not maintained very well. Buildings may still stay for a longer time. I mean, you can ignore it for 3 years and then one fine day come have a fresh coat of paint and, just accessorize a project. It may still look as good as new, but with landscape, you can't do that. If trees and plants die, then they'll have to be completely replaced, so you need constant maintenance. So, or your design has to be such that it doesn't need maintenance. So, whichever is the way. So, you need to be very, very aware of what are the maintenance requirements of your design. And then you need to ensure that hazardous trees as in trees which are already uprooted. Like in yesterday's rain, so many trees have been uprooted across the city. It's painful to see them, kind of falling down and, dying. So if there are hazardous trees, they have to be removed. If there are specimens or potential heritage trees which are worth saving, we should definitely put in our efforts to do that. And what are the tree protection recommendations? So you should ideally have a document which is tailor-made for that particular site, where you tell them that, okay, this particular tree needs protection. So why do you think so many trees are falling down in the city, in these winds and in these rains? I mean, trees which have not fallen down all this while. One of the prime reasons is because we go ahead and pave everything around a tree. Because when we pave, like when you have pavements all around a tree, what happens is the the area where the tree gets water, and we only leave a small opening right next to the trunk. So how do roots work? Roots basically work. They go and they multiply in those areas where you get more water. So when there is no water availability in the rest of that zone, because you paved everything, you've sealed the top, but you've only left an opening right next to the tree. What happens is most of the roots start concentrating in that particular area because it has to absorb maximum water for the tree to grow. So what are you automatically doing is you're automatically pruning the roots to kind of stay stunned, and not allow for the roots to kind of grow to a longer distance. So what happens is structurally the tree becomes very weak. Like the first gush of wind, the tree could fall down because the roots have been concentrated only next to it. So which is why, and it's amazing that our horticulture department never learned all these things. So when New Delhi was designed in the last century, somewhere around this time, so when the trees were planted on the sides of Lutyens Delhi, they would never pour water at the base of the tree sapling. What would they do is around 10 feet away from the tree, they would have a terracotta pipe, a perforated terracotta pipe which is inserted into the earth, and then filled with gravel. And the gardeners would basically pour water into those pipes. So these are perforated pipes in the soil. So when you pour water on one end, what happens is the water would leach out far away from the trunk. from the where the trunk meets the soil. So the roots automatically know or understand they're hygroscopic. They know that they have they're hygrophobic. Sorry, they move towards water. So what are you doing? You're automatically training the roots to move further away. So that those trees can have a much better rooting system. And rightfully so. You look at those trees in Lutyens Delhi even today, after 100 years, those trees are intact. Those trees haven't fallen down. They are perfectly fine. While the tree species which have been planted post-independence, post 1960s and 70s in the newer areas of Delhi, every monsoon, some trees or some of the other trees keep falling down because the engineers design the roads and the horticulturists come and plant the trees in that 1 meter space that has been given to them. The maintenance department has absolutely no idea, does not even care about whether these roots have to go to a distance or not. No, planting karna tha, planting kiya, file close kiya, project done. Next project. So it's very, very important for us to understand these finer nuances. Okay. So this is about tree inventory. So before you start a project, it's always ideal that you kind of prepare a map with the tree inventory in there as well. So and that's a very important aspect of understanding plants. Now, one very effective way of understanding a site is to actually do a land cover analysis. Now, when you have huge sites, like not when you have a smaller plot, but when you have huge sites, it's always interesting to understand the land cover. You understand which are those built areas, which are those areas where you have dense forest cover, which are those areas where you have moderate forest cover. I hope you can see the screen clearly. Uh, or which are those areas which have sparse forest covers, which are those areas where there are grasslands, and how do you differentiate between a grassland as opposed to a farmland? A farmland is where you cultivate, right? And then which are those areas which have an urban tree cover? So what is the difference between a forest tree cover and urban tree cover? Is that a forest tree cover is usually natural, it has a different mix of species, and it usually responds to the biogeographic condition of that area, while urban tree cover is predominantly those areas where we humans have gone and planted trees. I think some of you may have to mute your mics. There's a lot of disturbance that's coming up from somewhere. Yeah. And then which are those areas where you have wetlands, and what type of wetlands are those? That's also important. Is it a brackish water wetland? Brackish water means saline water, like where the seawater meets with the fresh water. Is it brackish? Is it a brackish wetland or is it a freshwater wetland? You need to understand the nuances of these wetlands. Now, within wetlands, there are different classifications. There are swamps, there are marshes. Marshes usually, so you may have heard these terms like bogs, swamps, marshes, so they're not interchangeable. Even though we architects sometimes call a bog a marsh a swamp, and all of it, but the truth is, that a marsh is a wetland which usually does not have wooded trees. So it only has these reeds that kind of grow out, and reeds and sedges. It doesn't have wooded trees, but it becomes a swamp when it has wooded trees in it. So you have a mangrove swamp because mangroves have wooded trunks. Um, or you have, like places like Bharatpur. If you have been to Bharatpur Wildlife Sanctuary, you have a whole forest of kadams, which are, which look like any other, tree grove during the summers, but during the monsoons, that whole area gets flooded with water. And it's in those trees that these migratory birds come and build nests. So, it's like it gives them protection from the predators because it's water all around. The predators don't easily come in and, kind of attack those trees. So it's an amazing way in which, trees adapt to the hydrological conditions, and, that the animals then adapt to those, habitats which kind of get formed. So it's amazing to kind of understand all these. And then which are those areas which are under seasonal vegetation? Now, if the site is remote and you've been given this project in May and you have to give your design by July, you only have 2 months. How do you understand what are the seasonal variabilities? One very easy way to understand this is to kind of look at the aerial mapping from different times. Let's say like Google Earth, for example. Like when you see that same spot in summers and when you see, oh, this is completely brown, then it's very easy for us to figure out which are those areas which are under seasonal vegetation and which are those areas which are, kind of under perennial vegetation. And then it's important to understand which are those areas which have a man-made landscape, the manicured landscaped areas, because they'll have a different property for you to analyze and understand from, let's say, a dense forest or a natural forest. And then, of course, the water body, the water cover. These are the various, land covers which one needs to kind of understand before you move into a larger project or a master planning project. Now, with animals. So it's simple. I mean, I don't have to really go into the details of this because we've probably spoken about this multiple times in the past lectures. I'm just reiterating so that it kind of gets into your brains. So we need to understand whether our site is actually a habitat for different species and which are those species? Are they native? Do they need protection? Are any of those threatened or endangered? You need to kind of understand that. You also need to know, are they invasive? Let's say, like, is there a termite hill there? Is it going to be invasive? Is it going to take over the entire project? Or is there a certain kind of bee or or a pest which could possibly pose as a health hazard to to people at a later date? So you need to kind of take all these things into cognizance, and then if there are snakes, don't be scared of snakes, because actually the truth is snakes are probably more scared of us than we are of them. And there is a way that and snakes don't really attack. They don't really attack with a vengeance, unlike what Bollywood movies make us believe. All the nagins who come to kind of take revenge. That's not how they work. So snakes are probably far more scared of us. But why are we so scared of snakes? One of the reasons is because of our evolutionary history. That in the past, when we were cave dwellers, a snake bite could mean death, right? We didn't have anti-venom at that time, and maybe there was no electricity in the night. Like you never know what used to happen, while you were staying in a cave. So we humans were always morbidly afraid of snakes. And but what is it now? So it's a way our brains have been wired. So we kind of carry that fear of snakes from that from those ancestors who were not killed by a snake or who really escaped a snake bite. And obviously that's why they could reproduce, have kids, and and that's how we are alive. So we are all progenies of those ancestors who've been extremely cautious and wary of snakes, and which is exactly the reason. It's our evolutionary psychology. Like that's why we are so morbidly scared of snakes. While the truth is, if you look at all around the world, the number of people who die because of electric shocks are way higher than the number of people who die of snake bites. But still, when you see a snake at a distance, you'll panic. You'll run, but you wouldn't think twice before switching off the geyser with a wet hand. When the truth is there are many, many more people statistically dying because of electric shocks. Or you wouldn't be scared if a small child goes and switches on, a light. But even if you see a snake at a faraway distance, you will be like, running and panicking around. So it's our evolutionary psychology. So nothing to do with landscape, but I just wanted to tell you this. Okay. So now we move to the other aspects of site planning. We'll quickly do this because we know this. We've done this in our first year EVS. So here, what you see is a very interesting graphic of the daytime and the nighttime land surface temperatures in Delhi. So what's interesting is that if you look at it carefully, the nighttime temperature is higher than the daytime temperature. Now, this is like an eye opener, so it was an eye opener for me as well. So large cities like Mumbai, Delhi, and all have this phenomena which is called the urban heat island effect. So what happens is most of our surfaces, even though the sun rays are, they are uh, capable enough of heating surfaces, of giving heat. What happens with most of the surfaces that we humans kind of create, the concrete surfaces, asphalt on the road and other things, is that these surfaces basically absorb the heat during the daytime, and especially towards the second part of the day, when the solar heat is kind of pretty intense in this part of the world because we are closer to the equator. It kind of absorbs all that heat, and in the night, it starts radiating that heat outside. So the way infrared, so heat basically travels in infrared rays. The way infrared rays work is that when the incident rays have a shorter wavelength, while so when you have a shorter wavelength, it has a higher frequency, so it can kind of pierce into objects. But the absorbed and the radiated infrared rays basically have a longer wavelength, so and a shorter frequency. So what happens is it kind of doesn't kind of really escape out of the the atmospheric cycle. What basically happens is it kind of stays within that area, and that is what heats up our cities. So a lot of our problems are basically man-made. If we would have thought of planning our cities in a way wherein, our concrete surfaces or our roads, why should roads be black in color? Why can't, I mean, there is a reason, economic reason, because it's coal tar, which we use for asphalt is basically a byproduct of the petroleum industry, so we are basically using it and it's black in color, so you're not adding any additives. But there are cities around the world which are now experimenting with white colored paint or a white colored, very extremely, strong coating on that surface of the asphalt. And there is empirical evidence that, the temperature of those areas have drastically gone down during the summers. There are case studies which are available online. If you could remind me, I can probably share some with you. So essentially, there are ways in which this can be sorted. But the first thing is understanding. The first thing is being sensitive to understand that it's not daytime temperatures which are the real problem, but it's nighttime temperatures which are. So when you talk of climate, there are two things. There's a macro climate and there's a microclimate. There is nothing much that one can do about the macro climate, like, by designing one project, but there is so much that you can do by changing your lifestyles or changing the way that you design to kind of help the macro climate. But like they say, one swallow cannot make a summer. So, like one project, and you do 10 projects which are completely unsustainable, and do one project and say, I am a sustainability warrior, doesn't help. So you have to be consistent, and everyone has to kind of join that bandwagon. So the basic elements of climate of solar radiation, wind, precipitation, you know what it is, right? It's rain, snowfall, etc. Temperature, humidity. A good design is one which kind of responds to these, be it landscape, be it architecture. So this is something that you would have learned in your previous lecture, so I'm not really going into the details of it. But be aware that in landscape, landform, way that the lay of the land is can actually affect the flow of the air, so it can affect temperatures, it can affect that perception of heat, it can affect humidity. So like if, for example, if you are building in the coastal environment, one of the most effective ways of creating a conducive, built or unbuilt environment is to ensure ventilation, because we have high humidity. And why do we sweat? Why does everything feel so chipka chipka in the summers and in the monsoons? Even though the temperature is not all that high, it's actually pretty cool outside, but because my window is closed, because I need to have this conversation with you, my fan is switched off, I'm literally sweating. The key reason is lack of ventilation, and the fact that there is a very high humidity in the atmosphere right now. So we need to be sensitive to understand these basic things. Uh, Understanding the or which side are the slopes facing, so in topography, there is something that I didn't really tell you about, which is we spoke about, elevation analysis, we spoke about slope analysis, but we never really spoke about aspects. So aspects don't really count in a city like Mumbai. But if you get a project, let's say in Assam or in Kohima or in Dibrugarh or any of these, hilly sites which are there, what happens is that, you may find that there are some slopes, where your site is faced, which may not even get sunlight throughout the day, because those may be slopes which are actually east facing. But then towards the eastern side, there is another mountain range which is so high that it casts a permanent shadow. If you go to Himachal Pradesh, you'd find a lot of villages, a lot of sites which are actually a victim of this problem. Like they don't get to see the sunlight at all, except for like 2 hours or 3 hours in the mid noon during summers. So, you need to understand, which are those slopes. So you need to understand the way that the land lies. So even if in a city you have multiple sites, like for example in third year, in AD you get projects in different parts of the world, different parts of the city, different parts of, like not all sites in, let's say, Nagpur would be the same, because it depends on which side is the slope, which side are there trees, which side are the buildings, so you need to have a fair enough understanding of all of these. You also need to understand the moisture conditions of the windward and the leeward side, because they could be drastically different. So essentially, there's nothing to do with landscape per se, but I'm just telling you because eventually you're going to graduate as architects who are going to design buildings. So that's why it's important. Now, what is in our control? Maybe these finer aspects of microclimate are definitely in our control. Understand where are the solar access areas. Understand how much is the temperature variation within the landscape or within the built environment, and it's always a great exercise that, you have done a project, and, as time goes by, you kind of go back and keep analyzing it. You keep taking the readings and you keep kind of understanding that, oh, in such a condition, when I did such a move, where I planted trees on this side, when I understood that this was a wind direction and I kind of wanted to kind of keep the winds there and not block the winds here, etc. What was the perceptual difference that basically came about there? So you could basically do these experiments. They don't cost a thing. They just need the right kind of attitude to kind of do it and the inclination towards it. So all that could really help you in kind of sharing the knowledge with the rest of the world as well as in your projects. You know, are there wind tunnels which are being caused because of vegetation or because of the fact that there are buildings in a certain way? Like for example, in BKC, there are certain roads which are windy all the time. And while the road which is perpendicular to it is like when one strand of hair wouldn't move out there, and that's basically because of the way those tall buildings have been placed. So it kind of funnels or channels the wind. Then what is the orientation of your building or of your landscape space? Like which side is it oriented? you know do you need to provide windbreaks? Now windbreaks don't necessarily mean you have to put those walls. You could also create shelter belts. So after the tsunami happened, one of the key recommendations that the government of India had kind of given out was based on the study that of which I was also part of, was that was of creating these bio shields all around our coast. Now when I say a bio shield, it doesn't mean a Chinese made wall that is kind of locked in place. No, that's not what it is. A bio shield is basically a a 500 meters or 400 meters or a 700 meters or a 1 kilometer long, sorry, wide stretch of a shelter belt where you plant trees interspersed with shrubs and plants which are naturalized to that particular ecology, which can withstand the salt spray, and which would also be planted in a certain spacing, which allows for the local villages and local communities to kind of plant other beneficial plants in between. So there is a way in which that bioshield works. So because you create that shelter belt, and shelter belts should never be thick enough so that the wind doesn't go in, because then what happens is the wind gets thrust up and it creates a negative pressure behind. So it sometimes when shelter belts are too thick, when you have a wall that kind of prevents it, you may have noticed it that behind the wall there is a lot of wind pressure, like because of the way the aerodynamics work. So shelter belts have to be porous enough to allow for some level of air penetration. So there are calculations which are on it. Maybe we can have a separate discussion on this if any of you are interested in knowing more about this. But one of the key recommendations was to create these bioshields. So even if there are villages, there are towns, you kind of create bioshields within them. So you encourage, private players to also plant these trees. So you are a part of that bioshield, and then give a certain sense of protection status to those areas. So, but it's been what? It's been 14 years post that, and I really don't know how much of it has been done. So it's important for us to understand, how can vegetation help out with all these? Um, then are there trees which kind of produce pollens? You know what are pollen grains, right? So why is this important is because pollen grains can trigger severe respiratory allergies in people, and that's very, very important because for you and I who don't get affected by pollen grains or by dust, it's something that we don't really realize it. But ask your friends who get affected by it. Their lives go on a downward spiral, when these plants start flowering. So it's very, very important. So there are some plants like Alstonia scolaris, which is called Saptaparni, or Satpatia. That's something that you find in many places here in Mumbai as well, which have been put on this list by the Ministry of Environment or the Pollution Control Board saying that one shouldn't plant it. It's not been banned, but it's been written as you may not plant it. The wording is such. So, you need to be sensitive enough to understand which are those trees and plants which should be avoided, which would actually be there. But having said that, you should not just ban all the plants which produce pollen. Okay, so that's not the deal because pollens are important. Pollen grains are needed for the reproduction of those plants, and honeybees, help in pollination. There are many insects that kind of depend on this process of pollination. So, pollens are good, but there are only some plants or certain densities of some plants in certain urban areas which have to be avoided. So, you could jolly well go and plant these plants that produce a lot of pollen in an area where there is no human habitation, or an area where it is a native plant, because the the human population that lives in that area probably also has a herd immunity to these things, so these are very complicated things. There are no real answers which can be told to you कि ये problem है, ये solution है. In ecology, there are all these things which are kind of completely intertwined. And then smoke sources, yeah. So that was about the natural aspects of it. And now I'll quickly tell you about the anthropogenic aspects of it. There isn't much for you to know, which is new knowledge in here, because land cover and land use. So you need to understand the difference between what is land cover and what is land use. Land cover I just showed you in that diagram, right? About man-made landscapes, as opposed to wetlands, as opposed to that. That's basically a land cover analysis. Understanding what is there on the land, so that is completely different from land use. Land use would mean that, it's a human-made, distinction as to whether this particular part of that plot is it or plot or city or or your site is it meant for commercial, is it meant for residential, is it mixed use, or is it industrial, so that essentially is land use. Never get confused between these. I find a lot of professionals also kind of getting confused between land cover and land use, and then there are bylaws which are set by us humans, so which also need to be responded to. Like for example, there is a ruling called the Coastal Regulation Zone, CRZ, right? So you can't build within a certain meter, area from the edge of the high tide line. So these are bylaws. So that may affect the way you build or the way you plan a site, site plan a site. So it's important for us to understand that the infrastructural abilities which are there of that region, of that particular site. So you need to know where the drain is. You need to know where the sewage line is, because otherwise you will design everything and at the end you will realize, oh God, my STP is in the southernmost edge, which is the lowest point of my site. But the um, the sewage line which has been put in by the municipal authorities are like 5 meters above on the other side, where is my road access. So it doesn't work that way, because in that case then you'll have to pump up what is the extra. So STP is obviously treat the sewage, but then there may be some things which cannot be treated, or if there is excess then you need to kind of put it into the main city led sewage line. So then you'll have to keep pumping it up every time, and if the pump goes wrong in some day, then you've had it. So you need to kind of understand what are the infrastructural availabilities. Even bus stops, for example, you need to plan your project with the bus stops in place. Are there cultural values which are attached to your site? That's also another very, very important aspect of dealing with a project which is contextual to that area. And then there are issues with pollution. Is there contamination at site? How is the air quality of that site? That's also an important assessment. So you need to kind of understand, if there is an existing, site, like let's say it's a brownfield site as opposed to a greenfield site. That's a very important criteria. If you've been given a project, if it's a redevelopment project, which basically means it's a brownfield site, a site where there has been, uh, habitation before, and in all probability there would have been some level of contamination on the soil as well. Like let's say all these industrial sites, like all these sites in Parel, which are being reproposed as, these high-end housing projects. So they may have a lot of industrial contamination because there were factories at some point in time. Maybe not the cotton mills, but there in Thane you have a lot of these fertilizer factories, and chemical factories which are now being repurposed as housing. So you need to understand, like what are the contaminants in that area and what are the remedial measures that you're taking and how are you going to go about it. So those are brownfield sites as opposed to, let's say, a greenfield site. A greenfield site is a site which has never been built before. Maybe it was an agricultural field, maybe it was a pristine forest, or maybe it was just a land. So it's very important for us to understand, the total site area versus the impervious areas. Impervious areas are those areas which does not allow for water to percolate in the existing site as well as in your proposed design. And then, so these are the impervious areas. You know it. These are the porous areas. I don't have to kind of go into it. Understand if there are contaminants from the past. So I spoke about it. Understand if there are any existing stressors, like, is there a noise pollution problem? Is there an odor problem? Like, for example, in Mahul, there is this RCF, Rashtriya Chemical Fertilizers. So I stay in Chembur, but I stay far away from Mahul. Like if I look outside my window, I can see that glittering cluster of Mahul, chimneys, like like very far, like it maybe like I don't know what, maybe 6 kilometers, 7 kilometers from where I stay. But it's one straight line. But you will not believe it, during some days in the evenings at around 5:36, when the wind is from the southern side to Chembur, and if my windows are open, I get this gust of chemical smell, and it's so amazing, that I would have never imagined before I actually took up this house, that I would even get to smell marble, the Rashtriya chemical fertilizers sitting here. But that's how interconnected the world is. So you need to understand, if there are existing stressors, around your site. Then is there any infrastructure that could be salvaged, into your building design, into your landscape design? Understand the infrastructure. What is a state provided infrastructure all around? I spoke about this. What are the transportation options? I spoke about it. So your building design should not be for car users alone. Your buildings, your landscape should be designed like your entry point, your pedestrian pathways should be at a point where it can then be connected to the road outside where there is a bus stop. So that not or if there are cycling tracks outside, let's extend them into a site as well. So be sensitive. Understand all this. What about this sanitary sewage system? Where does the water supply and the stormwater drain, kind of sit outside the site so that you can then eventually connect your systems to those, and all the others. Now, cultural values. Is your site in a context which has a lot of historical value? Is there any known or potential archaeological values? If there is, then please, be sensitive to that design. Are there any, cultural, like for example, if you're asked to design in, let's say, a site which is very close to Borivali National Park, would you respond to it? Like, or you were doing some interpretational museum in Bhimbetka, in those caves. Would you put a modern building right there, like, site दिया है ना government ने मुझे करना ही है, Bhimbetka तो अंदर है. Would you just design something, plot something there, or would you then kind of understand, like, does this come in the view shed of it, or is there something else that could probably be done? Would your design then, be sensitive to what is there? These are important concerns. Then, of course, there are bylaws. You know all about it, so I don't really have to kind of go into the details. Then, finally, the problem of contamination. Like, is that site a brown field or is it a gray field? Know, are there methods of remediating the site using plants and sunlight and the rains? So that is what is called phytoremediation. Maybe I can show you projects wherein phytoremediation has been successfully done. So you'd be amazed that you don't really need to use chemicals to kind of, clean up a site, but you could just use the power of plants and sunlight to kind of clean up sites. So water bodies which are, contaminated, all our rivers, all our drains, are all become nalas, right? So every water body has a self-cleansing ability. But what is happening right now is that, we've been dumping in more pollution than what the water body can really take, and that's where the problem is. And then are there, so that's phytoremediation. But in some cases, just phytoremediation may not really help. You may have to give some, impetus from our side, which is chemical remediation. So, like for example, even chlorinating our water. Our Mumbai Jal Board, basically chlorinates the water before the water comes to us. Chlorinating is one part of chemical, treatment to water. So there are many other ways, like sanitation that has been happening all around our cities because of the COVID pandemic. That's also we're using chemicals to kind of remediate it. And then nuclear contamination. So luckily for us in Mumbai, we don't have areas of nuclear contamination. But I remember in Delhi, around 5, 6 years back, in a place called Mayapuri, it is an industrial hub in the center of North Delhi, and there was some containment which had probably come in from Alang, like from some other country. It came to India in Gujarat, and then it was basically, some scrap dealer bought it, and it kind of, found its way to Delhi. And then, there were scrap dealers. They were kind of, opening out old metal things. They were, separating things. They actually broke open a nuclear device, and there was severe, contamination that happened. So there was a 3 kilometer or a 4 kilometer radius of Mayapuri which was marked as a containment zone. And imagine, there were people living there, there were factories there, and these people were not the ones who really had bungalows and had money to kind of move out to a different place. It was in the news for exactly a week. Post that, it just died down. So and I'm sure nuclear contamination does not just die down in a week's time. So, and then I'm sure there may be some studies. You can Google it up and check it. It's Mayapuri in Delhi. So like in the center of a city, like, like you don't really understand, these things could happen like anywhere. So it's important for us to understand nuclear contamination. And we have our Baba Atomic Research Plant with a research center, which is right next to our city, So it's not that we are, far away from all of this. It's like, so there are all these things which we need to kind of understand. So with that, most of those anthropogenic factors have also been kind of, taken care of. So with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. I'll pause the recording for the benefit of keeping the video short. If you have questions, you can ask me. I'm available. We can discuss it. And if there are very interesting case studies, I'll send them over to you through the next few days. So that's it. So I'll just pause the recording. Thank you.